Now we're going to go into classical conditioning, also called event conditioning. So you might extrapolate here that we're going to look at the relationship between two different events, between two different stimuli. And that is exactly what classical conditioning is. Now, I have already reminded you about our behaviorists and the people who were very strongly thinking that the environment is the only thing that matters. And even the name Pavlov, which is critical to our classical conditioning, he was in that same school of thought. So within that school of thought, we also had what are called the British Associationists. And these people believed that we acquire almost all of our knowledge specifically from conditioning. So, still from our environment, but specifically in the form of conditioning. And this is the idea that we're forming associations between stimuli in our environment. And the idea here would be that simple associations provide mental building blocks for all of our complex tasks. So we can form really complex associations, we can learn complex things from putting together a bunch of simpler associations and simpler learn links between items. So they had this stance. Now, you can't talk about classical conditioning without talking about Pavlov. But interestingly, Pavlov didn't set out to learn anything about learning. That wasn't what he was studying. So Pavlov actually specialized in studying digestive processes in animals. So his lab was set up to look at digestive enzymes with dogs. And by accident, in the process, he happened to discover classical conditioning. And he referred to that as conditioned reflexes at the time. So if you haven't heard the story, I'm going to summarize it very, very briefly here. But basically, Pavlov had a lab set up with a whole bunch of dogs, and from these dogs, he was collecting their saliva to specifically study the enzymes that were in the saliva. And so each morning, he had a grad student who would enter the door of the lab, and the door had a bell on it. So it would ring as he opened the door, and he would come in, and he would go around and he would feed all of the dogs. But someone noticed that the dogs would start salivating as soon as the student entered the room. They didn't salivate when the food was prepared and brought to them. It wasn't that. They were salivating, they were drooling before the food was even taken out. And so they started wondering, okay, well, why are they salivating? What's going on? And they figured out that the sound of the bell was eliciting salivation. And here, when we talk about something eliciting a particular response, we're saying that it's driving or causing that response. So here, hearing a bell caused the dogs to start salivating. And so this process of associating that bell sound with getting food became known as classical or Pavlovian conditioning. And of course, there's going to be multiple names for all of these different things. I tend to stick with classical conditioning. Sometimes Pavlovian will creep in. Both are correct. And I believe our textbook loves to shorten it to CC, especially in some of the figures. So instead of writing out classical conditioning, you might see CC instead. And this classical conditioning is going to be a form of learning in which a neutral stimulus comes to signal the occurrence of some second stimulus. So in this case, our neutral stimulus is the sound of the bell over the door. And that sound of the bell is indicating the occurrence of a second stimulus, which would be the dogs getting their food for breakfast. So that sound of a bell elicits that response because the dogs know that food is coming. And we are going to spend a lot of time going over this because this chapter involves a lot of terminology and a lot of very particular concepts. So it might seem repetitive, but in the end, it's going to help it stick with you. So we're just going to go with it. So speaking of terminology, when we're talking about an association between stimuli, an association is just a relationship between those two stimuli. When we talk about acquisition, this is the period when you are learning that association. So at the beginning, when the student opens the door and the bell rings, the dogs don't know that that means meat is coming, that they're not going to get fed. But over time, they will learn that when the student comes in and the bell rings, they will get fed. So while they're learning that association between the bell and food, we can call that the acquisition period, where they are acquiring an association. And this is why I warn you that this topic is terminology heavy, because we're going to continue with terms for multiple slides. So our next specific term is going to be a conditioned stimulus, sometimes shortened to CS. And so a conditioned stimulus is that previously neutral stimulus that comes to elicit a conditioned response. So in our example, the bell that started out as meaning nothing to the dogs, that started out as a neutral stimulus, becomes a conditioned stimulus once the dogs have acquired that association. So we're going to talk about it almost exclusively as a tone or a chime or a bell, but you can do classical conditioning with pretty much anything. You can classically condition pigeons using colored squares, and that square can still be a conditioned stimulus. It's all in how everything is framed. But we'll stick to bells for now while we're getting used to the terms. Our next term is the unconditioned stimulus. So if our conditioned stimulus is the stimulus that they have learned something about, that they have learned an association with, the unconditioned stimulus is some biologically significant stimulus that already has a response associated with it. And so what I mean by that is if the animal it encounters this particular stimulus, there is going to be some kind of automatic response to this stimulus, and they don't have to learn this response. So really common unconditioned stimuli are going to be food or pain. So if you give a dog a bowl of food, you don't have to teach the dog to start salivating. They're going to salivate because it's food and they're eating it. If you expose someone to pain, they're usually going to pull back from it. They're going to exhibit pained behavior. And that is an automatic response. It's just going to happen. So this unconditioned stimulus isn't something that they have to learn to respond to. They're just going to respond naturally to it. So it's unconditioned, meaning that they didn't have to learn it. And now we get into the responses. So we can have an unconditioned response, which is the response associated with that unconditioned stimulus. So unconditioned means it's the one they didn't have to learn about. So when you give a dog some food, that unconditioned response to food is going to be to start salivating, to drool. Now, if we look at our conditioned stimulus, this is where we start having to pay attention to what the source is of the behavior. So with enough pairings of our conditioned stimulus, that bell ringing, with the unconditioned stimulus, getting food, then the conditioned stimulus will elicit the same response as the paired unconditioned stimulus. So what this means is that if you ring your bell and then give the dog food enough times, if you ring the bell, give them food, and they drool because they got food, then you ring the bell, you give them food, ring the bell, give them food, ring the bell, give them food. They learn that when you ring the bell, they will be getting food, and they start to salivate, they start to respond specifically to the conditioned stimulus, the one that they've learned about. Now, the important part here is that the conditioned and unconditioned response is the same thing. In both cases, the dog is drooling, the dog is salivating. What we care about when we're naming it is what's causing that response. So if the dog is drooling because of the food, then they're drooling because of the unconditioned stimulus, and that drooling is an unconditioned response. If the dog is drooling because of the bell, because they learned an association, if they start salivating when they hear the bell, they're salivating in response to that conditioned stimulus. And so the response is a conditioned response. But in both cases, we're looking at the dog drooling. So you're going to just focus on why they're doing that behavior. Now, first time through, classical conditioning does not always sink in for people. So we're going to go through it again with different images, the exact same terminology, and then we're going to see if that sinks in. And then we're going to do it again just to make sure. So here's our classical conditioning procedure. So we have our soon-to-be conditioned stimulus. Keep in mind that before you start training, the sound of a bell is a neutral stimulus, especially when they haven't learned anything about it. So this will be our conditioned stimulus. We also have our unconditioned stimulus, the thing that you don't have to teach them about. And then we have this unconditioned response where the dog drools. So at the beginning, when we first start this procedure, you ring your bell, then you're going to give the dog a bowl full of food. The dog is drooling, but they're drooling because of the food. So if you do that once, you can't really expect them to have learned anything. So after just a single pairing of our CS and our US, our conditioned stimulus, and our unconditioned stimulus, if you ring the bell, the dog isn't really going to do anything. And that's because they haven't learned anything. So what we're calling our conditioned stimulus at this point is probably still just a neutral stimulus. It doesn't mean anything yet. But if we do this, say 20 times, so you ring the bell, you give the dog food, ring the bell, food, bell, food. If we then present that bell on its own, then the dog would be drooling because they've learned that this bell is associated with food. And in this case, when the dog starts drooling, we know it's a conditioned response because they're doing that behavior, they're drooling in response to our conditioned stimulus. And if we want to look at this a different way with the graphic from the textbook, we can have, they use a tone instead of a bell, but a particular sound. And they break it up into before conditioning, during conditioning, and after conditioning. So before conditioning, you have your tone, and the dog doesn't do anything because what does a tone mean to a dog? So this would be our neutral stimulus. If you give them their unconditioned stimulus, which they call a UCS, some people use US, some use UCS. This is why I try and say the whole word. I prefer US, but this is what the image has, so we'll take it. But if you give them that unconditioned stimulus, if you give them food, they're going to elicit an unconditioned response. They're going to salivate in response to the food. during conditioning or during acquisition, if you pair that tone and the food, our soon to be conditioned stimulus and our unconditioned stimulus, you're going to be getting this unconditioned response. Because during training, the dog is mostly responding to that unconditioned stimulus. But once this conditioning has happened, once they've learned that association, if you present that conditioned stimulus, even by itself without the food present, you still get that response, that salivation, and now it's a conditioned response because it's happening in response to the conditioned stimulus. All right, so for this unconditioned stimulus, we're talking about food so far, and food's a pretty good one because food is something that we have a strong reaction to. But if we wanted to look at other unconditioned stimuli, what else could we use? We can think about what makes an effective unconditioned stimulus. And so to be effective, an unconditioned stimulus should evoke some kind of strong bodily response, a strong natural response, something that they don't have to learn, something that is unconditioned. So psychology has used all kinds of crazy unconditioned stimuli. Sometimes they can stimulate parts of your brain to make you feel certain feelings. They've done experiments where the unconditioned stimulus would be a drug or a chemical substance that causes a bodily response. Loud noises to elicit a startle response. We've already talked about food. And the idea is that the more intense an unconditioned stimulus is, the easier it will be to produce a conditioned response using that unconditioned stimulus. Now, there is a limit on this. You will sort of hit that point where you've got the best association possible, and making a stronger unconditioned stimulus kind of gets to be detrimental. So if we think about our loud noises, if the sound is too loud, you might just damage the animal's hearing. If you stimulate their brain too strongly, then it might cause brain damage. So there's always a limit to this intensity. But the general rule of thumb is that the more intense this unconditioned stimulus it is, the easier it is for this learning process to happen. And now when we're talking about these unconditioned stimuli, we can categorize them a couple of different ways. So we can classify them as appetitive. So a stimulus that the animal finds pleasant, things like food or play, things they'll enjoy. Or you can have things that are aversive, a stimulus that the animal finds unpleasant, a loud sound, maybe darkness. And so you can train these associations from either appetitive, things they're going to enjoy, or aversive stimuli, things that they won't enjoy, but both can be used for classical conditioning. So let's talk about an example with appetitive conditioning. And we're going to stick with dogs because why not? So to calm your easily agitated dog, you want to use this classical conditioning. So you're going to use the command word calm with feelings of relaxation. And so we can set this up where our unconditioned stimulus, the thing that the dog is going to respond to naturally, is petting them. So when you pet your dog, they're normally going to find it relaxing and calming. It'll make them happy. So our unconditioned response is that feeling of calm or that calming response. So that's what we're starting with. Our conditioned stimulus, the thing that you want them to learn about, is going to be the word calm. So what you're going to do is whenever you're petting your dog, if you're going to pet your dog to help them relax, before you pet them, you can say the word calm. Or maybe you're going to sit there and you're going to say the word calm over and over again while you're petting your dog. Have multiple pairings all at once. And eventually, if we start forming an association between this conditioned stimulus, the word calm, and our unconditioned stimulus, that petting, then eventually just the command word calm, our conditioned stimulus, will be enough for them to start calming down. So if your dog is easily agitated, once they've learned this, if you're out and about, even if you don't have time to sit and pet your dog, you could just say calm to them and they would feel those calming feelings. And they would feel them in response to the conditioned stimulus. So we would know that they're a conditioned response. Now we can look at another example, but this time with aversive conditioning. And again, sticking with dogs, maybe you don't want your dog to pull on their leash when you're walking them. Because if they're tugging on the leash, then they could pull you into traffic, they could cause problems, it's unpleasant for you. So maybe now you're going to use a leash that slightly constricts when the dog pulls on it. So while you're walking, if the dog starts to pull aggressively on the leash, then their collar will get a little bit tight and they will feel discomfort. So that constricted leash is an unconditioned stimulus. And the unconditioned response is that they feel uncomfortable because of that leash. And so this time we're going to use the same conditioned stimulus. Preferably this would be a different dog. You don't want to confuse them. But you could say calm when they start pulling. And so if you're saying calm and they're pulling and experiencing discomfort because of the pulling, then you can eventually get them to learn that saying calm happens before they pull on the leash and feel that discomfort. So just saying calm could make them feel uncomfortable and stop pulling. So you form an association here and get them to have that response of discomfort in response to your conditioned stimulus. Now, there are tons and tons of examples of classical conditioning, both aversive and appetitive. So if this is something where you're not quite wrapping your mind around the difference between them, I would highly recommend Googling it, because pretty much every introductory psych course that has ever been taught is going to cover this topic. And they're all going to be using different examples of the same concepts. So it is a fantastic way for you to learn and test yourself and get good at recognizing all of the different components of these processes.